Welcome to the impact of 2020 on higher education, colleges, COVID-19, and a time of racial reckoning, a virtual Radcliffe event. This discussion is presented as part of the Presidential Initiative on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, a university-wide effort housed at the Radcliffe Institute and chaired by Radcliffe Dean Tomiko Brown-Nagin. I am Mira Levinson. I'm a member of the faculty committee on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, and I'm also a professor of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Today's panel discussion comes at a crucial time. Heightened attention to racial injustice, democratic fragility, and structural hyper-inequality, all in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, which exacerbates these ills, raises complex questions for university leaders, faculty, and staff. Universities have crucial roles to play as generators of research knowledge about these challenges, as distributors of educational, economic, social, political, and cultural capital and opportunity, as communities purportedly designed to model intellectual virtue and the search for truth, and as institutions responsible for caring for young people, including educating, housing, and feeding them. But at the same time, universities are starting to grapple, perhaps more than ever before, with their own historic and present-day roles as bystanders to, and even perpetrators of, injustice. How can universities confront their own legacy of complicity and reorient toward intellectual, economic, political, and racial justice, even amidst a pandemic? Speakers on this panel will discuss the challenges faced by students today, the role of university presidents and leadership during turbulent times, and the ethical costs of upward mobility in higher education. We are excited that you have joined us to explore how higher education can and should rise to the many challenges of 2020 and beyond. We will hear from three speakers today. First, Eddie R. Cole, Associate Professor of Higher Education and Organizational Change at the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. He is the author of The Campus Color Line, College Presidents and the Struggle for Black Freedom. Next, we'll turn to Anthony Abraham Jack, Schutzer Assistant Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and a colleague of mine, Assistant Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He is the author of The Privileged Poor, How Elite Colleges Are Failing Disadvantaged Students. Finally, we will hear from Jennifer Morton, Associate Professor of Philosophy and core faculty in the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is the author of Moving Up Without Losing Your Way, The Ethical Costs of Upward Mobility. We also have a terrific moderator for the conversation, Kemiyawi Wapepa, a PhD student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. First, we'll have brief remarks by each of our speakers. Then Kemi will moderate a conversation among the group. She will then, following that, moderate audience question and answer with the speakers. We encourage those watching to use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time during the program. And the speakers will address as many of them as they can. Since we anticipate a lot of questions, we have many hundreds of you on here, we ask that you keep your questions short. This will increase the number of questions that we can answer. It is now my pleasure to pass the virtual floor to Eddie Cole.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you to Radcliffe for bringing us together for this urgently important conversation. That said, I want to briefly offer some historical perspectives on how issues of inequality have been intertwined with race and racism in higher education. So I'll start in Chicago in the 1930s. In July 1937, the Chicago Defender, the nation's most prominent Black newspaper, published an editorial under the headline, "The University of Chicago and the Black Belt." The newspaper described, quote, "a sinister movement designed to impose further residential restrictions of race citizens on this metropolis." This is a notable editorial because by this point, Chicago had established itself as a strictly segregated city with racist housing practices dating back decades. But over time, the number of neighborhoods with racial restrictive covenants increased. These covenants, these agreements among white homeowners forbid them from selling or renting homes or apartments to non-white residents. Particularly, they even forbid the sale to other white people who may potentially rent or sell to non-white people. Yet, by 1937, a new community member had started supporting these restrictive covenants, the University of Chicago. This is a significant moment in U.S. higher education history. As the editorial board for the Chicago Defender explained, it was one thing to challenge the racism of individual citizens. It was another thing when a powerful campus with its university administrators started actively promoting restrictive covenants among property owners in the areas adjacent to the university. In response to public critique, particularly from Black citizens in Chicago, University of Chicago Chancellor Robert M. Hutchins published his own letter in the Chicago Defender. He responded by explaining that the University of Chicago admitted Black students on the same terms as white students. In fact, as evidence, he pointed that the youngest student in the freshman class entering in the fall of 1937 was a 13-year-old Black student. The chancellor's public response emphasized that the presence of a few Black students was evidence that the University of Chicago certainly was liberal in its thinking and far more progressive than, say, segregated universities in the South. In private conversations, however, behind the scenes, actions spoke louder than words. Throughout the 1930s and the 1940s, the University of Chicago spent more than $100,000 on, quote, community interests, the bulk of which were used to protect these restrictive covenants. And this also presented a model for other universities across the United States. In 1951, when Hutchins was succeeded by Lawrence A. Kipton as chancellor, Kipton, the new chancellor at the University of Chicago, quickly assessed that the overcrowded Black neighborhoods near the University of Chicago was not a local problem, but it was a national issue. Therefore, by the mid-1950s, Kipton at Chicago had organized a meeting with presidents from Columbia University, the University of Pennsylvania, Yale University, MIT, and even Harvard's Nathan Pusey. Each of these were located in similar urban settings. Soon, administrators at New York University were buying property near Washington Square. Campus officials at Temple University in Philadelphia also acquired 40 acres and were looking to purchase more. Harvard looked to, quote, reestablish friendly relations with Cambridge. Eventually, dozens of universities were involved with urban renewal. And that's the informal name for a federal program that earmarked millions of dollars designed toward clearing urban blight. This only furthered the long-standing contentious relationship between the university and local Black residents. Yet in the process, as Black residents were raising concerns around race and racism and housing discrimination and the role of higher education in that discrimination, university leaders at these institutions moved forward. University of Chicago administrators and others actually testified before a Senate subcommittee to have an amendment, an alteration done to the Federal Housing Act that earmarked millions of dollars toward institutions of higher education. By 1959, the University of Chicago by itself was involved with a $135 million urban renewal project across city, federal, private, and university funds, according to the New York Times. By 1960, that total had gone up to $195 million, according to Newsweek. The director of public relations for the University of Chicago actually wrote a letter to NBC requesting a television feature on the universities because these universities had positioned themselves that they were doing something to save American cities. When in reality, what was really happening was 2/3 of Chicago's 86,000 residents that had been displaced by urban renewal programs were Black. 2/3. That history demands that we step back and ask critical questions about today, noting that even this panel, being part of Harvard's Legacy of Slavery Initiative, it is appropriate that we also remember our more recent racial history in higher education, a history where individual academic leaders have made decisions that tell us that higher education has always had moments where it commits to serving a few Black students, a few Black faculty, some Black staff, but not too much Blackness on or near university campuses. With that being said, I'm gonna pass the virtual microphone over to Tony to tell us a little bit more.
Thank you, Eddie, for providing that historical context to this moment that we find ourselves in, and the way in which our universities have played a role in shaping the lives not only of its students, its staff, and its faculty, but those who are on the other side of the town-gown divide. And I want to pick up on a point in where you left off, right? Admissions as a signal of progress, right? We have used in many times throughout history, who we have on campus as a signal of, look, we're not X or we're not Y, whatever negative thing, like we're not anti-Semitic, we have one person who's Jewish. We're not, against women, look at this woman who has risen through the ranks. And yet that's usually where the conversation starts. We use it as a signal of progress, yet it sometimes signals the opposite of just how little progress has been made. And my biggest thing when it comes to thinking about this as a sociologist, and especially as a sociologist who is deeply invested in the lives of children and youth and how inequality shapes their life chances, is admissions only focuses on who gets in. And yet we don't, in some respects, care or even think to care about their experience once they get inside the gates. And in this moment of both COVID and racial unrest, we have to think about the fact that COVID did not create an unequal system, but it did give us a clearer picture, a clearer view of just how unequal it is, and especially who is disproportionately affected by it. Now, for me, I study students who are lower income and who are first generation college students, meaning they are first in their families to go to college. And what we saw in March of last year, when campuses were beginning to close, is now the difficulties that everyone is facing. Like, we see clearer now the difficulties that our students have struggled with for so long, right? The digital divide, the access to internet, and access to food, and access to different things that we take for granted. And yet, I hope in this moment, we all begin to question some of the studies and some of the approaches that literally just thought that differences in GPA were reflections of attitude or drive or ambition, or somehow just some marker of how smart you are, without taking into consideration these kind of structural hurdles that now we cannot escape when we turn on the news. Because so many of our students before are food insecurity. Right? If you think about the research that's coming out from Sarah Goetz-Robb and the Hope Lab about food insecurity in college on college campuses, where estimates sometimes as high as 2 out of 5 students, mainly on our community college campuses, are food insecure. But now it's not just our lower income students who are disproportionately affected by food insecurity. And again, food insecurity happens at community colleges as well as our Ivy League institutions. In my work, I demonstrated how even at an Ivy League institution, during breaks, students were food insecure, right? Students during recesses from Thanksgiving, Christmas, spring break, and other times that the university deemed that they want to be on break, upwards of 1 out of 7 students, of every 7 students, were food insecure because the campus shut down, and what students had to do to bridge the gap when there was more semester than money. But here's the thing. As many of our students that in many ways ignored before, who were food insecure, even more so now, are facing insecurity around food, because there's no money left. People have been furloughed. People have been laid off. People are sick or too sick to work. Those working class families that were only 2 or 3 paychecks away from the poverty line or experiencing impoverished conditions are now experiencing it in the same way that their lower income peers were, because there is no safety net. In the same way, the middle class families who were 3 months away from the poverty line, one true sickness away from it, now they are experiencing food insecurity and other insecurities that many lower income students are facing with to this day. I bring up these because now universities have to find a way to respond to these changing norms. Because now, previously, when we thought about addressing insecurity, financial security, it was only through financial aid. One, we have an issue now that many more people are going to be applying for and recipients of financial aid. but going beyond financial aid for support that you need, because it's not just about the money. It's not just about having enough resources to make it into the school when you are forced to be almost like a second-class citizen at a first-rate institution because you don't come from the same resources, or you and your families are dealing with all the troubles that now we must all recover from. Who's disproportionately getting laid off? The fact that COVID is disproportionately raging through certain communities. If you are from a Latinx community in North Carolina, even though you are 10% of the population, you are 41% of the deaths. When you think about Native communities, the numbers are equally, you are a minority in the population of the state, but you are disproportionately the most common group to be contracting COVID, let alone dying from it. Blacks as well, like the numbers, the way in which COVID and the racial reckoning that we are dealing with is almost doubling down on the entrenched structural inequalities, like the one Eddie talked about in his opening remarks, like redlining and blockbusting and racism and the FHA loans and different things that basically created the middle class and gave them a sanctuary from many of the social ills, but disproportionately funneled that kind of inequality into Black and brown neighborhoods. But one thing that I want universities also to pay attention to is that when we think about this moment that we're in, it's not just about having the resources, but it's about also how we deliver them. Because all too often, those students and those members of, whether it's undergrads, graduate students, it doesn't matter, those who are most in need of support and who would benefit the most from supports on campuses are least likely to do it because they encounter that hidden curriculum, that system of unwritten rules and unset expectations that if you have not been on a college campus before, if you're not comfortable navigating a particular very narrow set of behaviors, you don't know how to navigate office hours. You don't know that you can or should go to mental health services to deal with. Because it's not just, again, it's not just the universal reality of pain that COVID brought, but it's the uneven effect of that pain, that hurt, that loss that certain communities are grappling with, that universities have to be able to be prepared for. And I want to specifically talk about, this will be the last point, when I say the resources, I mean, we need to really rethink some of how our offices support our students, especially mental health services. If we don't take this moment to deal with the trauma that so many of our students are facing, a lot of the differences that we see in graduation, academic performance, awards, time to graduation, everything is going to be more a reflection of inequality than it is of intellect. And if we don't help students deal with this pain and change our framework so that then we can change our behavior and our policies, we will continue to privilege and do a disservice to our most driven, most talented students on campus. And on that point, it's an honor for me to hand the conversation off to Jennifer Morton.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you to Radcliffe for putting this together. I'm so excited to be here. So as I see it, a theme that runs through the work that Eddie and Tony and I are doing is uncovering and revealing the way in which institutions of higher education work and don't work for students of color, low-income students, first-generation college students, and the communities from which those students come from. And my own work has focused on first-generation and low-income students. And I started writing my book as a result of my experiences teaching at the City College of New York, where I saw that a lot of my students were coming to college with the hope of really transforming their lives, getting a college education, getting a good paying job afterwards. But a lot of the challenges they confronted had to do with the important and critical support roles that they played to their families, to their friends, and to their communities. And so I had many students who, for example, had to decide between studying for an exam or coming to class or babysitting for a cousin who had childcare fall through, taking a grandparent to the hospital, or working full time to support a disabled parent. And what I saw over and over again was that the ways in which the safety net had failed families ended up landing on the shoulders of those students. And so as those students were sort of starting their lives and getting excited, going to college, trying to get a degree, they were also in this position of having to help families, friends, and others around them and the people that they loved. And often this kind of push and pull of feeling torn between pursuing their own educational advancement, their own opportunities, and being there for the people that they love was very difficult for the students. And so in my book, what I argue is that many first generation and low income students have to pay these ethical costs. And what I would want to bring out with that word ethical is that these are valuable aspects of all of our lives. And that to ask, as we so often do, of first generation and low income students, that they sacrifice these really critical aspects of their lives in the pursuit of higher education is part of the unjust system that we have in place in higher education these days. Now, I think what has happened with the pandemic is that it has exacerbated these ethical costs in a number of ways. Now, on the one hand, you have first generation and low income students who are back home. And so I see this with my students at UNC who were here, maybe on their first year of college, and they were dealing with the distance from their families and how to navigate that. And now they're back home. And for some of them, that's actually kind of joyful, right? They get to be with their families and their siblings and so on. But at the same time, these critical support roles that these students play are becoming more and more important because the safety net is failing low-income families during the pandemic. So as parents lose their jobs, students are deciding that they're going to go and work even while they're attending college full-time at the grocery store or at a Starbucks or wherever, just to help their families weather the financial sacrifices that they're having to make. Younger siblings and cousins who are home from school because schools are closed, and who's tutoring those kids? It's the college student who's back home and their parents can't afford to not work. And so college students are stepping in and providing those critical support, childcare supports. Students who get sick or their parents get sick and are in very distressing situations because their parents can't access quality health care. So all of these ways in which the pandemic has brought up like the problems in our social safety net or the non-existence of our safety net for low-income families, students, college students in particular, are often in the position of being the ones that families can turn to step in and help out. Of course, that comes at the expense of them doing well in class, being able to focus, being able to study, being able to get the grades that they need, and so on. And so we really put students in this impossible situation, and this pandemic has exacerbated the ways in which students feel torn and in which they're navigating this kind of having a foot on both worlds, right? Trying to figure out how to join this community, to become a college-educated professional, and at the same time, be there for their families and friends. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I will now turn it over to Kim.
Great. Thank you so much, all of you. This is such an important and timely conversation. I'm going to start off here with a question for Dr. Cole. So you spoke to us a little bit at the beginning here about the University of Chicago and how the leaders of the university sort of advertised their acceptance of Black students in order to obscure their role in housing discrimination in Chicago. You also, though, in your book, talk about how ultimately it was the persistent demands of students, alumni, and local community members who held the university accountable. So in my perspective, it seems like we may be having a similar moment in 2020 where universities across the country publish statements that are in support of Black Lives Matter, yet may be continuing to engage in policies and practices that are harmful to Black people and Black communities. So I'm wondering, what lessons can we learn from the past about how to hold our university leaders accountable to these public proclamations of racial equity?
Oh, that's a great question. Let's get right into it. So history demonstrates a few things for us, but the most notable thing for what gets university administrators' attention and what's a way to hold them accountable has always been media attention, unfortunately, right? So, and particularly what happens throughout history is, particularly in the University of Chicago example, you see students, alumni, community members put the contradictions of the university before the general public, beyond the walls of the academy. And so one instance being, throughout the 1950s, University of Chicago is actively using media to portray itself as doing something good with urban renewal. In reality, you see the numbers, and the students eventually get enough attention with reporters and so forth, and that raises the priority for how the university has to respond to that. So that's one particular thing. But we see that today, and I'm glad you mentioned that about 2020, the connections. Two examples. University of Georgia, when John Lewis, the late congressman, passed, like many universities, they issued a public statement. University of Georgia had a statement that said, call Congressman Lewis an American hero. Pretty standard. We saw that coast to coast across the United States. A few months later, by September, the University of Georgia said it would not allow for on-campus in-person voting, right, for students there. And so if you were interested in voting in the 2020 election, go into the community of Athens, Georgia, and find the nearest precinct, something of that nature, right? You see the contradiction immediately, right? John Lewis dedicated his life to voting rights, yet the University of Georgia celebrates John Lewis, yet even in 2020 contradicts itself when it limits a way for thousands of students who are on that campus to vote. That's one example, right? But once the attention came, Washington Post, CNN, the university quickly retracted on that decision. Another example will be around policing. We're having some serious conversations about policing in the United States right now, but that's also relevant to higher education, as universities have large police departments on campus. Northwestern University, Evanston, Illinois, just north of Chicago. Great example right now, to where students all summer have been asking to see the budget, if you will, around Northwestern policing, and that hasn't been produced. But when you have a university like Northwestern, where 6 to 7% of the students are Black, yet up to 40% of university police initiated stops are of Black people, again, you see the contradictions. And so one thing is to make those contradictions plain in the media, if you will. But I don't want to put all the labor on students to hold university leaders accountable. It's enough students have to worry about. There are things that university leaders also need to do, and it starts with history. Too often university administrators know their institutional history from a broad standpoint, founding dates and sort of turning points, but they don't know the human history of their university. And you have to know about people, because people make universities work. And so for any university leader seriously about rising to the challenge of 2020, you should have a standing meeting with your university archivists and your local historical societies, just like you often meet with your vice chancellor or vice president for finance and so forth. And so there are things that both students can do to hold academic leaders accountable. Academic leaders themselves also can hold themselves accountable.
Great, thank you so much. I'm now going to move to Dr. Jack for a second question. So you talked about how the topic of social class is not often addressed with much depth or nuance on college campuses. And you illustrate how many low-income students at elite colleges must contend with what you call structural exclusion. So this is university practices and policies, such as closing residence and dining halls during spring break, which lead to problems such as food insecurity that marginalize low-income students. So as we know, this past March, many universities abruptly closed their doors, sending students home to finish the school year online. And today, many university residence halls remained closed as classes continue to be held remotely. So I'm wondering, how might these current closures and pandemic policies perpetuate the structural exclusion that you've written about? And also, what might universities do differently at this moment to better meet the needs of low-income students?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one that I've been grappling with, because I do want to understand what is the responsibility, what should universities do, and what can they do? But then also, I don't want Viacom and Sprint and AT&T and other places to get off the hook for not providing opening their hotspots to people, because it's not, when I talk about structural exclusion, one consequence of it is food insecurity. Another consequence is housing insecurity, not knowing where your next meal or if you will have a place to go at the end. And as I was doing my study, you know, of the 80 or so colleges that have no loan financial aid policy, so those who are most progressive when it came to aid, only 1 in 5 kept their dining halls open during spring break. Some colleges would actually charge students a daily rate to stay in their room or the room of someone else. And so if many students couldn't go, and it wasn't just lower income students, it was students who had fraught relationships with their family, either because of gender, sexuality, and other aspects of their identity. When campuses closed, one of the first things I said was, we have to do, it's a smart thing, it's the right thing to close campus. But if we do, we have to leave room for those students who know that home and harm are synonymous. We have to keep our places open to be better able to support our students, especially for those residential colleges and the colleges with the resources to do so. Because for many of our students, as hellish in some respects as the time can be in college, college provides them with things that many of us take for granted. I never thought that a book about first-generation college students that was near and dear to my heart would actually be part of a pandemic response for colleges and universities. But it was because of the opportunity to, again, change the framework and actually understand what kind of environment are our students coming from, right? Not just what type, you know, that high level, as to borrow Eddie's framing of like, oh, we have 42 Jennifers in our class, or we have 32 Michaels, you know, actually understand the communities that people are coming from, because many of our students live in internet deserts. And so I wanted universities to actually do more work, and some colleges actually did, where they put a map of where their students came from and then connected that map to all of the food banks and food pantries in those cities in which their students actually come from. So colleges have to move beyond, again, supporting their students through financial aid and actually matching them with their resources, right? And I hope, again, borrowing from Eddie's work on the leadership that college presidents can do, I want more college presidents to be more vocal about the stimulus package and the aid that students need right now. We need more voices arguing and pushing for the kind of financial and also resource supports that students absolutely need, because we need them to, again, push AT&T and all these places to open their hotspots, because you can't be on Zoom if you can't be able to log in. We need to support our food banks and food pantries, who are literally the saving grace of many communities around the country. Universities can start their partnerships to be able to help students in serious ways. And for those campuses who are investing millions of dollars to keep their Division I football teams in play, despite COVID cases running amok, invest that money into actually helping more than just the 85 or 110, however many students are on a particular team. Like, do the brave thing and cancel sports and actually invest in the education. You can't be student athletes if you're not a student first, which I know is a conversation, that's a whole other conversation that we can have, but the institutional priorities are being put on Front Street in many ways, and it's showing that the market conditions of athletics and other things are overpowering the primary objective of educating tomorrow's citizen and citizen leaders. I hope that as colleges, for those colleges who are staying closed, for the whole class, priority is given to those students who cannot be fully involved in the academic enterprise away from campus. For those students who either don't have a home to go to, or who, again, whose home is synonymous with harm. I hope that as we go into the fall of next year, the same principles of supporting students and providing them a social safety net that the US government will never do is a priority to help students be able to fully engage with the academic enterprise.
Thank you. My next question will be for Dr. Morton. So Dr. Morton, you talked about in your book how we have a misleading narrative in the United States about upward mobility, and we're not fully honest with low-income and first-generation college students about the ethical costs of this upward mobility. You state that it is crucial that those who want to support students on this path, teachers, professors, mentors, families, fully appreciate what they are asking students to do. So I'm wondering, in the context of the pandemic, in the context of 2020, what are some of the hidden ethical costs that might be exacerbated or even newly created? And additionally, how can those of us who are supporting low-income or first-generation college students more fully appreciate what we are asking them to do in this moment?
Thank you, Kimmy. Yeah, so I think that one potential silver lining, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit more, of the pandemic is that it's forced college instructors, professors, and all of the other people that do teaching on colleges' campuses to confront some of the challenges and sacrifices the students have to make, because now we're in students' homes and we see that their internet access is not great, or it doesn't exist, or that a younger sibling or cousin is running into the room while they're trying to be in class. I've had students who were in a home with parents who were in the middle of getting a divorce before COVID hit, and now we're in a space, as Tony was saying, where they didn't feel safe at home, or home wasn't a place where they could focus and pay attention. And so in some ways, students have already been dealing with this before the pandemic in many ways, but now I think college faculty can't look away. I think before we could go into our classroom and see a sea of faces and sort of, think that we were doing our job by just giving a lecture and grading some papers and setting office hours and not explaining to students what those meant. But I think now that we're seeing what students are dealing with, that we're looking into students' homes, the situations the students and the sacrifices they're making are very present and becoming clearer and clearer to those of us who are teaching. And so I think that it is an opportunity for us to think more about how we can connect with students, how we can get students to connect with each other, how we can open up the doors to dialogue with students and create kind of flexible and welcoming teaching spaces where students can flourish despite of what's happening at home. And so I'm somewhat optimistic that this will kind of force the professoriate to think a little bit more about what we're doing in the classroom. One of the arguments that I make in my book is that institutions of higher education have a duty to think more carefully about how they're providing opportunities for first generation and local income students to find new communities, to build new communities, to find new connections, to find mentors, to connect with each other. And unfortunately, having most of our classes over Zoom makes it very difficult to do that. We have to be incredibly mindful about giving students a chance to connect with each other, to connect with us, to really pay attention to students that are feeling maybe disengaged, or who are starting to not come to class or not turn in their work or whatever it is. And so I hope that this will force us, when hopefully one day we go back normal, to be more mindful of the kind of community that we create in the classroom, and whether it's one that can serve all students, not just the students that already come prepared to take advantage of a college education.
Great, thank you. So sort of picking up on that idea of silver linings, I have one last question for all of you, and we'll try to keep our answers to this one succinct because we have a lot of great questions coming in from the audience, and I want to make sure we have some time for those as well. So for this last question directed toward all of you, what is one potential silver lining of the pandemic that you see here? So what is one potential policy or practice in higher education that you think has the potential to shift in the wake of 2020? And also, what can we do to ensure that such a shift comes about? And if we could start with Dr. Cole and then go to Dr. Jack and then Dr. Morton.
Yeah, that's a great question to really get us going into the full discussion. First thing that comes to mind, just to be brief, these issues aren't new, and that's important for us to remember. And so even when I think about history and all the racial tensions, inequality that we're grappling with right now, first thing that comes to mind is sort of the 1963 when affirmative action programs in higher education were being developed. And that gives me this idea of thinking about what it could have been versus what it is now. What it is now, we most often think about race considerations in college admissions on highly selective, pretty, elite, if you will, colleges and universities. But originally, those plans were much more expansive. The plans around what affirmative action could be were, system-wide change, structural change within the U.S. higher education system. So that was inclusive of, say, historically Black colleges and universities as well, right? It wasn't just about the institutions where we are. And so you can imagine there's an opportunity that when we were grappling with a national moment of race in the 1960s during the Black freedom movement, higher education initially responded to what it could have seen, system-wide change, but it was a pump fake. It pumped the brakes and turned its attention toward the usual suspects. I think right now we have an opportunity again to sort of think about system-wide change throughout the U.S. higher education system to where there's resources and how we think about the educational enterprise is applicable to more campuses, to more people, to different corners of the United States. And so that's, it's on us right now to think critically about this moment in history where we've been here before and what we could have done differently and how we have an opportunity right now to change the trajectory of higher education.
Yeah, I hope we take hold of this moment. There's one thing that I want, I get one question a lot, like what is one thing that I wish more people knew about or could do to make colleges more inclusive? And the one thing I always say is I wish we could all take a truly nuanced, but yet a real crash course immediately on just how unequal society is. You cannot escape it right now. We cannot escape the fact that that even the most, what we thought of as the most stable suburbs are struggling right now. Those communities that people have had resources and good parks and quote unquote good people are struggling right now financially, socially, emotionally. I hope that this provides higher education with a shift in framework, so that it can have a corresponding change in policy and change in behavior, not just of institution leaders, but also the students who arrive on campus. Because if we can actually think more critically about where we are coming from and the difference in experiences, the difference in resources, and the difference in opportunities that people have had en route to college, we won't have such a very privileged set of behaviors and outlooks that we value more so than others. There's a philosophy, and I got this from William Julius Wilson when he talked about what motivated him, and he's read other people, and he always said one of the most powerful things that he read was about equality of life chances, where you can actually go into, by zip code alone, go to a nursery at a hospital and be able to determine with statistical accuracy who's going to jail, who's not going to live between 18, who's going to not go to college, or vice versa, who is going to go to college and more likely a selective college. Right now, place is so important in understanding your immediate life chances that I think people can have a sense of the kind of inequalities and the kind of the fragile nature of mobility, that I hope that when we start thinking about everything from doubling the Pell Grant, which is an initiative that is on the table right now, to other forms of revising FAFSA, to university leadership and the town gown divide, I hope that we have a better understanding of our nation, inequality, and let that provide an influence for our framework and not just what was before the COVID times.
Yeah, that's great. I think to add a little bit to what I said before, I think one silver lining I hope is that professors will rethink their teaching and pedagogy. But I also think that students are starting to demand better teaching. And I see this. So one of the things that happened during a pandemic is and I don't necessarily recommend this, I just decided to subscribe to the Reddit thread for my university campus. You see students just complain and talk about who is doing a good job of teaching their classes and who isn't, and how disconnected they feel, and basically what they want and what they need from their professors. And so I hope that this will lead students to demand more of us as teachers and not just as scholars, because I think that this is highlighting how much the kind of old model of pedagogy of the professor lecturing is not one that works for most students. And I think when you have it happen on Zoom, it becomes very clear why it doesn't work to just listen to someone talk to you and not have the opportunity to try out, the skills and knowledge that you're being expected to learn yourself, or to talk to each other or figure out problems together. And so I think that hopefully not just professors, but students themselves will demand better teaching, because I think better teaching will help all students, and in particular, low income and first generation college students.
Great, thank you. We're going to move on to some questions from the audience now, and I will direct particular questions to each one of you so we can hopefully get through a few. So this first one actually is for you, Dr. Morton. Someone has asked in the chat, they're a faculty instructor, and they're wondering what is something they could do tomorrow or even next semester in their class that can better support students during this time?
Great. Yeah, I think trying to figure out more opportunities for you to talk to students in smaller settings. So one of the changes that I've made with my classes is that in my slightly larger classes, I'll divide students up into groups, and those groups meet regularly every week. And I join a different group every week. So before the kind of larger class. And so I get to sit down and talk to 4 or 5 students, different students every week, and for about 45 minutes. And that really gives me an opportunity to get to know some of the students in a way that it's hard to get to know when they're 25 or 30 or 40, depending on your college campus, people in a Zoom room. So it's a smaller, more intimate setting. And I try to have more and more opportunities like that, where I am interacting with the students in a way where we're having a conversation. It's a smaller group. And I feel like I got to know almost every student in a class that it would have been difficult to do that if I had just left the standard format of me talking and then having the students ask questions. So I really do think like small group work, and in particular where students meet with the same group over and over again, so they get to know those 4 or 5 students in the class, and you meet with those students on a regular basis in that smaller group, that can really allow students to feel comfortable, not just in that setting, but then I find that students, once they've gotten to know me in that setting, come to office hours more often, feel more comfortable reaching out and sharing a challenge that they're facing, or a reason why they can't turn in a paper on time, or if they need additional support, because they just feel comfortable after having been in that smaller group setting. So I've been pleasantly surprised by how well doing something like that works.
Great, thank you. Dr. Jack, this next question will be directed toward you. You mentioned mental health as something that universities should take a larger role in addressing for students. And one of the questions here brought up how, particularly at this moment, a lot of university faculty, and I would argue perhaps even graduate students who serve as residential advisors, have been pushed into this role of providing a lot of mental health support, emotional support for college students. And that doesn't necessarily seem like the best system or a very sustainable system. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how structurally mental health might be better addressed by universities.
Yes, I appreciate that question. Even before COVID, mental health was not ready. Mental health counselors and officers were not ready to support the students that we have on campus. Mental health officers are amazing people. I'm not saying that they are doing it on purpose. What I'm saying is, if we don't pay attention to the inequality, we can only be prepared for so much. They are used to dealing with two major sets of issues, with others, but two major ones: the death of a grandparent while a student is in college and divorce of parents. Those are two modal experiences that just about across the country, mental health officers can help students deal with. But as colleges began to diversify, they were not prepared to deal with the more place-based inequalities and problems that students dealt with. So whether it means people in your family dying of black lung because you come from a rural factory town, or the closing of a mine, or you are from a place that's riddled with violence, gun violence, and that's highly localized, they weren't as prepared for the new sets of issues and problems that a more diverse population has. What I hope in this moment is that we not only increase the number of mental health officers, because in my opinion, their caseload is way too big. Their individual caseload is much too large for them, healthy for them and beneficial for the students, but also to diversify the trainings and the trainings and the skill sets of every individual person who works in mental health services. Because what you don't want is for the one Black, the one Latino, the one Native person in the office to then be then just to shove everybody else and everybody to them, so that other people can just abdicate responsibility for serving, which we also know happens a lot with any organization. As soon as you have a diversity person, that person then handle everything of color, everything queer, everything non-binary, just like, oh, go talk to this person. And so what I want is not only an increased number of mental health officers as a priority for colleges right now, diversifying that staff demographically, but then also diversifying the trainings so that you are aware. Because right now, again, COVID is universal. Everybody is experiencing it in some way, shape, or form. But people are dying people of color are dying in a disproportionate rate to their white counterparts. Lower income families are being hit with it compared to their middle class counterparts. And gender is also something that, women, because of service work and other things, that we can't ignore. The way in which I believe that we need to make sure that we are also prepared for the consequences of the callous disregard for life that we are seeing. And then especially at the end, when you think about the death at the hands of the police officers that we have witnessed on social media, on the news, that we can't escape from, people of color are getting hit from both sides when they have already been on an unequal ground compared to their white counterparts. We have to be ready to help students through not just COVID, not just police brutality, but the combination of those two, plus everything that was already place-based before we entered this moment.
Thank you. Dr. Cole, this next question will be for you. Someone has asked for university leaders who might be facing conflicting messaging from alumni, particularly around what positions they should be taking or what university money should be spent on. How can university leaders deal with those very strong but sometimes opposing alumni opinions?
Good question. So I write about this a lot in my book because this isn't a new tension. This is something that's been with university leaders for quite some time. And ultimately, something that emerges in that particular situation is a college president, a university administrator has to reconcile where they stand on an issue, both professionally and personally. Right. And when those two things line up, it's easier for those university administrators to make plain to that particular group of alumni where the university stands and why it stands there and how the university is going to move forward. Ultimately, ideally, a university administrator would love to have everyone happy, but we see throughout history and we see today that it's impossible to have all these different alumni groups happy, right? Trying to be on the same page about how to spend university funds and what direction things should go. And so ultimately, sometimes, what we see the most effective university leaders who have been most successful in advancing the fight toward racial equity in higher education have been able to take that stand and clearly articulate that to alumni and ultimately move forward regardless of what the pushback may be for those alumni. And that has oftentimes been loss of particular funds and donors and so forth. But what we see in history, again, looking across dozens of universities, across dozens of decades, across multiple decades, you see that this is something that university leaderships have to do, and they move forward. And as one particular group may withdraw their funding, alumni support, another group, university like clockwork, oftentimes steps forward and steps up when they see university leadership committed to a particular issue. So not a new issue, but certainly that's one particular approach that we've seen successful in history.
Great. It's almost time for us to wrap up, but we have time for one last question. And just like the previous round of questions, if you could each just quickly say a remark in response to this, and then we'll close out. So someone has asked a question in the chat about the importance of systems of support and mentorship for faculty of color on college campuses. And I would also perhaps add to that just generally first generation, academic faculty. And so I'm wondering, in your own experiences, what is something that has been supportive or helpful to you on your own academic journey that you think others could benefit from as well?
Well, Eddie was my mentor at the Spencer National Academy of Education Fellowship. So if it's one thing that I benefited from that relationship then and continue to do so, I think one of the best things that faculty of color and first-year faculty can do is two things in tandem. One, apply to every grant and piece of money that you can so that you can do your research on your own terms. And especially when it's attached to a group like Spencer or Ford, where you are then entered into a community of other scholars where you can ask questions from everything from negotiations to how do you handle when you go up for tenure or when there's a problem in your class or you're not seeing eye to eye with your chair or dean. I think building a community for yourself of people at and especially outside your institution is one of the most valuable things that you can do. As a graduate student, I still am connected with a lot of the people who I reached out to, and definitely as a young faculty member who is navigating this world for the very first time, it is definitely securing the bag, getting that money, and then building yourself a community.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think for me, Spencer and finding networks and knowing people like Tony, all of that has been critical for me. But also there are there have been senior white faculty members that have really taken me under their wing. And the way to find those people is often by word of mouth. At least within my field, you kind of know from other people who are the faculty who are willing and able and excited about mentoring students of color, about mentoring young women of color. And if you kind of pay attention, you will see who are the faculty who really take that mentorship responsibility seriously once they get to a certain level of their career. And I think being able to find them often requires kind of keeping your ear to the ground and seeing, what you hear from other people, other people that this person has mentored. That really mentorship is critical. And I think it helps to have mentors that are also people of color, but it's not necessary. I have found that there have been, other mentors that I've had who just took their responsibility as mentors very seriously.
And I'll just say briefly, I ditto to the idea of mentorship and group coalition support, but also for faculty of color, particularly people new to academia. You just have to stay focused on your heart and what you know your work is to be and what questions you are committed to pursuing. That is what will, support you just as much as other people, knowing what you're committed to, knowing the work ahead of you, because that's where it is. Academia, the academy, will easily steer you in so many different directions away from what you know your focus to be. But if you keep that in mind seriously, that will go a long way. And when you get people around you who are also committed like that, you're building out a support group that won't only get you through, say, the pre-tenure, but you were talking about a fruitful career and mentor many, many people for years to come.
What a great, hopeful, and inspiring note to end on. Thank you all so much. So this does conclude our program for today. Because we didn't get a chance at the beginning, I do want to acknowledge the Massachusetts tribe whose land we're on today. I also want to say thank you to our panelists for their wonderful presentations and to our audience for their thoughtful questions. And I also want to say thank you to the Initiative on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, housed at the Radcliffe Institute, for the support of this event. For information on upcoming Radcliffe virtual programs and to see videos of past events, please visit www.radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us, and take good care.